Did you know that most people in prison got there on a plea deal? And did you know that many of them, when they plead out, get more than what they bargained for? Welcome to Crossroad Connection. We're speaking out for those left unheard. My name is David Scheringa. I'm the president of Crossroad Bible Institute and the host of your program. I have with me in the studio today Nicolette Chambry, who is the advocacy coordinator for Crossroad Correctional Services. And Crossroad Correctional Services is the advocacy arm of Crossroad Bible Institute. So welcome, Nicolette.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
It's good to have you here to catch up. We like to have you on the program every once in a while so we can keep our audience informed in terms of advocacy. We have found to be something that's important. We need to help prisoners change their hearts and lives, but we've also found that society has systems in place that kind of work against returning citizens.
Right, yeah.
And also other kinds of systemic issues. Last time you were on the show, if I recall, we talked about prison and jail access issues that we're facing, and that's not quite resolved yet, is it, in terms of access for our lessons?
It's a perennial challenge, but we're making headway. We're doing okay.
Now, most people are probably not aware of the fact that I think 90 or maybe 95% of people in prison did not have a trial by jury.
Right.
But they had a plea bargain that they accepted.
Right, exactly.
So what happens in a plea? Let's first start there. When they plead it out, they accept a plea, what has occurred?
Usually plea deals are a better bargain than taking a risk at trial. So a lot of times the prosecuting attorney will offer you an alternative sentence, fines, things like that, so that you don't have to take that risk, go to trial, and potentially be subject to mandatory minimum sentencing, or a longer sentence than you would serve from the plea deal. So by doing that, what a lot of people don't realize is that they are thereby triggering collateral consequences of conviction.
And I want to get to that. In a minute. That whole collateral consequences, because that's what I meant when I started off the program. They get more than what they bargained for, right? But let's go back with the plea idea. What you're saying, and I wanted to get some pushback on that. You're saying that if they take a plea, they will get a better deal than they might if it goes to trial. Is that always the case?
No, presumably so.
That's what they'll say to them.
Right.
They'll say, if this goes to trial, you're liable to get 10 years to life. If you take this plea, you'll be out in 5. Is that sound like TV, or is that reality?
No, that's reality. And I think, even when making those offerings, the prosecuting attorney or whoever it is, I don't think that they have, ill intentions when they're saying that. Sometimes they probably don't realize that what they're offering carries with it additional penalties.
But don't they sometimes exaggerate the potential consequences of not taking the plea in terms of, well, we're going to charge you with this, and this, and from what I understand, those things would never play out in court anyway.
That's hard to say, and I don't know that I would be the expert to comment on that, but I think that they do have a pretty clear idea of what they can charge a person with, and I don't think a defense attorney would disagree with, if they did go to trial and this is what they're laying out, this is what they're going to charge you for, that's probably exactly what's going to happen.
Do people ever get over-sentenced in plea deals?
Again, I don't know that I would be the one to comment on that, but certainly, it's at the prosecutor's discretion a lot of times, so that could...
Right. Okay, so let's get to the subject of the hour. It's a mouthful. It's called collateral consequences. Explain what collateral consequences are, and then we'll get down to some details.
Sure. Collateral consequences of conviction are the additional penalties that are tied to accepting a plea deal. So there are over 38,000 collateral consequences.
So just make sure, I don't mean to interrupt you, but okay, so these are additional consequences that are tied to a plea deal. So if a plea deal says you serve 1 year in prison, there's other stuff that are attached to that, and is the person aware of that?
In very few cases, because, like I said, there's so many collateral consequences, and they vary upon the state. And there are so many different parts to those consequences that attorneys, defense attorneys, and even some judges and courts are not responsible for that information, especially because there's no way to access all of that.
You mean there's consequences tied to that plea deal that the lawyers and the judges aren't even fully cognizant of?
Right.
How is that possible?
Like it's
That sounds insane.
It's horrible.
So okay, I'm getting excited here. Give me an example of a collateral consequence. We'll talk about more of them. Let's just say, I've accepted a plea deal, and give me an example of something that was tied to that was not revealed to me.
Sure.
And I don't find out about until later.
Right.
Okay, give me an example.
The most salient example that started, the increasing awareness around collateral consequences happened about 4 or 5 years ago, in a court case called Padilla versus Kentucky. And this was an immigrant who had gained legal status here in America and had lived here for 40 years.
How many years?
40.
40 years.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
And
he was an undocumented?
No, he was here as a legal resident.
As a legal resident,
Yes.
Okay. All right. Legal resident, immigrant for 40 years.
Right.
Okay, keep going.
And he was charged, it was a drug charge, and his attorney actually misadvised him. In this case, he was aware that there was potentially a collateral consequence that could affect this man's legal status, and he ill-advised him to accept the deal, and then after the fact found out that...
And this was his lawyer who was aware of it?
Right.
But he didn't tell him?
No, he did. He said, it's fine. This is not going to compromise your legal standing in America. And then it came down to, after the fact, he accepted the deal, and it carried a mandatory deportation.
After he gets out?
Right. And actually, I don't think in this case he had to go to prison at all. But by accepting that deal.
So there was a consequence of that plea that he lost his legal status.
Right.
Okay. Give me another example.
A lot of times, some of the bigger ones are for anyone who is incarcerated, and they tie to especially drug offenses. That's a big one. So say you are incarcerated, you accept a plea deal, maybe you go to jail or maybe not, whatever that is. And then you get out and you'd like to go back to school. You're not eligible for any kind of government funding or loans to go back to school or college.
Because you were an ex-felon?
Yeah, because that's just a particular...
And they're never
in some
eligible?
In some cases they are, in some cases they're not. And like I said, there's all of this information. I hope as we're talking it's becoming more obvious how complex this issue is, and just now for the first time in the history of collateral consequences has there been a database where an attorney, it's actually not even completely launched yet, but where an attorney can choose this or select the state that they live in, the offense, and then it will bring up all of the statutes that apply to that particular offense.
As you know, I'm on the Faith Advisory Board of the Brennan Center for Justice at York University of Law. In fact, a board member of ours is a deputy director there, Myrna Perez, and we have been working tirelessly to restore the voting rights of people who were formerly incarcerated in federal elections. Is the fact that in a particular state a person is never allowed to vote again or has to jump through an awful lot of hoops, is that a collateral consequence?
Yep.
So that's
one
an
of the
example.
biggest ones.
That's one of the biggest ones. We are all aware of that.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so you accept a plea deal. You have collateral consequences, perhaps, of not being able to ever get a college loan to increase education, of course, which itself helps recidivant rates lower if you have more education.
Right, exactly.
You may be not allowed to vote, which is an extremely important part of being a contributing citizen invested in your community rather than entitlement. So here's two collateral consequences that are actually hurting their return, right?
Right.
What's a third one?
There's actually a few more. That barriers to housing, barriers.
What's a barrier to housing? What, for example,
for a drug offense, a lot of times you're not eligible for public housing. Then, if that's on your record.
Oh, okay. Okay. How about food stamps? Is that a problem?
Yep, that's also a problem, and that obviously directly affects the women and the children who rely on that
Now,
income.
what would be the rationale behind not being able to have food stamps?
I think that there's a couple different arguments. Certain kinds of federal aid like that come in the form of cash, and because of that,
They might use it for drugs.
right,
Or trade it for drugs.
right.
Ah, okay. Is another collateral consequence that they may not have been aware of is random drug testing?
Yes, I don't think that's a collateral consequence. I do think that that's part of the actual sentencing or trial. So that would be a direct consequence. And those, of course...
That's a direct consequence, not a collateral consequence.
Yes, so that's the distinction.
Okay.
That's helpful to make. But another one would be you lose your license, your professional license.
Professional? You talk about a driver's license?
Well, yeah, driver's license I would say would be the most innocuous, if you could describe it as that. But you could lose if you're a dentist, if you're a doctor. I mean, those kinds of certifications could be revoked depending on what the offense is.
So what's your position on this in terms of collateral consequences? It's possible that they started for a good reason, but they seem to be hurting. Seems to me two things. Seems to me to be putting barriers up to a successful reentry. And secondly, it strikes me as continuing their punishment.
Yeah, it absolutely does, because you have to consider that these consequences are in addition to your parole or your probation requirements, the fines that you have to pay, the incarceration that you undergo, and it's really discouraging to see that. But I think that by upping the ante, we think that we're going to get different results. So we keep making tiny penalties, that attach to various offenses, and some of them are very small. But I think the government is also in a position where they want to come up with the most useful policy that can apply to the most people, and by doing that, they're not, it's faster. I think that it moves things along quicker, and people don't have to spend the time and work through like a case-by-case basis of, yes, this person has a drug offense, but do they really pose a threat to, our living community, things like that. It's just, no. They're
so what you're
automatically
saying
barred.
is that these are blanket issues, blanket consequences, rather than decided on a case-per-case basis. It must vary from state to state.
It does.
Which states are more egregious or progressive than other states when it comes to collateral consequences?
They all differ. I know New York, though, has a pretty lenient housing policy, and they're actually being really proactive about lessening the kind of consequences that, especially for drug offenses.
And this is for public assistance for housing.
Right, and public housing eligibility and food stamps and things like that. People are really starting to make a strong case for, we can't do this to people anymore who are returning to society or who are struggling with an addiction, because they're never they don't have the resources at hand to make a change. Right.
When they just get out, no one wants to rent to them anyway, and they can't get jobs.
Right.
These are mostly the poorest of the poor, and yes, they committed crimes and so forth, but it's not in society's best interest for them not to get a start.
Right, exactly.
And so if we're erecting barriers, they're going to end up right back in prison, I think. And so it becomes very self-defeating. As someone who studied this, should all collateral consequences be banned? What's your position? Or your thinking?
If I said yes, then I would probably be as bad as the government creating these blanket policies.
That's clever.
Or
yeah.
if I say no. But I think that so many thousands of them could be lessened, if not completely eradicated, because like we're just talking about some basic things like housing and employment. When you get down to the tiny details of collateral consequences and other situations that we didn't talk about, it's just unnecessary hoops that these people have to go through that take a lot of time and that end up costing them a lot of money.
It seems to me, Nicolette, that it's not unreasonable to expect, even if they don't want to remove any of the collateral consequences, at the very least, all parties involved, the judge, the lawyers, the defendant, should be aware of what they are. Now there are so many that nobody knows that half of them exist and stuff, right? It's like what I say with raising kids. Sometimes parents have so many rules that the kids can't remember them.
Right.
God gave us 10 commandments. Why do the parents have 100? But the same thing here. There's something insane going on and wrong going on if there's so many that nobody knows what they are. At the very least, there should be a list, and anything that's not on a list should not be enforced.
And that's why this database that's actually being created by Margie Love and an attorney named Richard Cassidy, that's why it's going to be such an incredible tool to have, because it will be nationwide and you can access it right online.
So you can find out what the collateral consequences are to certain penalties.
Yes.
And who's funding that?
It's... You know what? Actually, I don't know, but it is. It's being funded, I think, by an organization or a foundation, and the name escapes me.
You started or are part of a collateral consequences work group. Can you tell us about that? Who's part of that group, and
Sure.
What are you guys trying to do?
It's a small work group. There's representatives from the Sentencing Project, the National Employment Law Project, the Legal Action Center, and the Drug Policy Alliance. And collectively, each of us follows a different issue related to collateral consequences. But my particular area is the actual act, the Uniform Collateral Consequences of Conviction Act, which would really implement a great structure. It's procedural. It's not at all, banning any kind of collateral consequences as they stand. It's really just a guidelines for, okay, how do we use these or implement these effectively? And it's never been enacted in any state, which is kind of discouraging because it's an incredible piece of legislation. But right now we're working in New Mexico, and we're hoping that we'll be successful there for the first time.
Well, our time has flown by. Thank you very much, Nicolette. We'll have to have you back again. We appreciate your work of being an advocate, speaking out for those who can't speak for themselves.
Mm-hmm.
And so you can see that there are a number of ways, numerous ways, in which a person who's accepting a plea is getting more than he or she bargained for, and we'd like to see that remedied. Thank you for being with us today. My name is David Schuringa, and I hope to see you again right here next week.